Let me check. Okay, that was the ding dong that says we have started recording. So here we go. We're still covering flatworms, and a major subgroup within them is the Trematoda. We've already talked about one subgroup, the Aspidobothria, the ones where many of them have that really big, wide, oval-shaped sucker on the ventral side divided up into compartments. Trematodes are endoparasites, some in blood, some in other tissues, liver, for example, lungs, bile duct, the fasciola, liver fluke that half of you saw in lab yesterday is a bile duct parasite, and there are others that can colonize lungs, including human lungs, in a couple of species. And there's others that will munch on your liver. There's a paired suckers that allow attachment to tissues. There's one around the mouth, and then typically there's one on the ventral side. There's a few that don't, but by and large this works. The life cycle usually involves multiple hosts, switching between a mollusk and a vertebrate, although as we saw, the Aspidobothrians are kind of, well, you know, whatever about that. They don't always have the elaborate life cycle. So today we'll cover digenea. That's the flukes. Digenea means 2 generations because these always alternate between a sexual stage in a definitive host, a vertebrate, and an intermediate host in, or an asexual stage in an intermediate host, a mollusk. There may be various secondary hosts or paratenic hosts as well. I realized as I'm looking at it, this is not the clearest diagram and it probably ought to be colorized. But if you look below, at the bottom of it, that blobby thing is a parakaryon or a cyton. That's the body of one of these epithelial cells. And right at the center, there's a letter C that is marking that process, that extension that the cyton sends up between the muscle layers. One of those muscle layers is labeled MF, and then they come up over the muscle layers and spread out. And the top layer that you're seeing with all of the grains and granules in it, that's that tegument. That's the secondary epidermis that replaces the ciliated epidermis. Digeneans will have little spines. They're labeled TS1 and TS2 here, spines of the protein actin, and various pits labeled SP for stupid pits, I guess. But the same basic thing that you'll see with variations in tapeworms and all other members of the Neodermata. Eggs hatch out into Miracidium larvae, which look like this. This is one of them shown under the scanning electron microscope, and you can clearly see they're covered in cilia. The Miracidium transforms into the next stage as soon as it enters the intermediate host. Sometimes the mollusk might eat eggs and they will hatch inside. Other times the Miracidium will swim up to the host, a snail, and burrow into its tissues. It depends. But this is a newly hatched Miracidium. Here's one about a day later, and right about in the center where you see the letters RL, that stands for ridge layer, and that marks an intercellular ridge, which is right where the cytons are pushing up through the muscle layer and creating that layer of syncytium. That ridge layer is where they've started to do it, and the ridges are going to get larger and larger, and they'll spread over the larva, and the ciliated epidermis degenerates. So that RL right there is where that new epidermis, that tegument, is beginning to appear and grow and spread. Typically, eggs will pass out of the definitive host in feces, sometimes in urine. The eggs hatch. Usually the intermediate host is a snail. Sometimes the miracidium burrows in, and sometimes the snail eats the egg. The miracidium transforms into an asexual stage called a sporocyst, which is basically a blob. And the sporocyst does not have a mouth or gut or anything like that. The sporocyst just starts budding off internally. So a mature sporocyst looks like a blob with more blobs inside. Depending on the species you've got, sometimes the sporocyst will bud off daughter sporocysts. Sometimes the sporocyst will, those internal buds, turn into a second larval type called a redia. And those break out of the sporocyst, ready or not, here they come. And you can tell redia because they have mouths and guts. Sporocysts do not. Sporocysts are blobs containing blobs. The redia may reproduce asexually again and produce multiple little swarming, free-swimming larvae called cercaria. I should mention that depending on species, some sporocysts will bud off more sporocysts. Some will skip the redia stage and bud off cercaria directly. There's variability in the life cycle. There are stages that can be doubled or skipped compared to the outline that I'm giving you. The basic life cycle is based on the sheep liver fluke, Fasciola hepatica, which half of you have seen and the other half will next week. But looking at the diversity, sometimes there can be stages that are skipped, and sometimes there can be multiples of one stage, like those daughter sporocysts. But in the sheep liver fluke, anyway, the sporocyst bud off the redia produce multiple cercaria, and the cercaria leave the intermediate host, and they'll swim. We were trying to get cercaria out of pond snails in lab yesterday. Didn't work so well. I will hope for better results next week, and I'm going to try some different collecting spots. Even though we didn't get anything, it might just be interest, I'm just going to try different spots, and maybe we can find better locations and then start asking why. So even though we didn't actually see cercaria emergence yesterday, I'm not giving up. Anyway, those start swimming around. Sometimes the cercaria will just burrow right into the definitive host and metamorphose directly into an adult. I think I've mentioned this before, but people who go swimming in, ponds and creeks and things like that, if there's cercaria in the water, they can develop a condition called swimmer's itch, caused by cercaria trying to burrow into human skin. They don't succeed. As far as I know, humans never get successfully. No, I take that back. There is an exception where humans do get burrowed into. There's a big one. But for your typical creek around here, those would not infect you, but they can get deep enough into your skin to cause an allergic reaction, which shows up as an itchy rash. So you would not get infected this way, but they might burrow into the feet of ducks, for example, or into the tissues of a fish. In others, the cercaria forms a resting state called the metacercaria inside a cyst. Those are fairly dormant. They can persist. The cyst can persist for a while. And commonly, the metacercaria gets eaten by the definitive host. And when the definitive host eats the metacercaria, the cysts hatch into sexually mature adults, and round goes the circle of life. So if we look at this in the sheep liver fluke, on the left, that's an adult, and they can get pretty big. The slides that you had in lab yesterday, you could see they got up to 1 inch or more. Most of all of that tubing that they seem to be filled with is reproductive organs. Now, we'll talk about those in a bit. They lay eggs. The eggs hatch into miracidium larvae. I should mention, this being a sheep liver fluke, the eggs hatch out in feces. The miracidia larvae will swim just in the dew, the natural moisture in a grassy pasture, especially if it's wet, or if it's just rained, or if it's kind of a flooded pasture anyway. The miracidia will swim around until they burrow into a snail. There they develop into sporocysts. You can see that's a sporocyst with some redia developing inside. The sporocyst develops into redia, and at the top of that drawing, you can actually see an oral sucker and a simple gut. Redias have guts. Sporocysts don't. And inside the redia, you can see some cercaria beginning to develop. There's the cercaria, and by the time you're at the cercaria stage, that's pretty much a miniature of the adult, except it's got a tail. So the cercaria come bursting out, swim around, develop into a metacercaria, and in the case of this species, the metacercaria form on grass blades, and they'll sit there waiting for a sheep to eat the grass, as sheep do. And once the sheep has done that, they will transform into an adult, crawl into the sheep's bile duct, and they can self-fertilize, I think, but if there's two present, they will copulate, make lots of eggs, and round goes the great circle of life. Little bit about anatomy. As is typical for trematoda, there's a sucker around the mouth, and you can see it at the top left of this picture. That's the mouth. Usually there's a ventral sucker on the ventral side. This is what you see at the bottom right, that round thing. This is also called an acetabulum. If you're curious as to where that name comes from, you have acetabula. That's the name for the socket joint in your pelvis, right? Your thigh bone or femur has this big ball sticking out, and this fits into a big hemispherical socket in your pelvic bone. That socket is called your acetabulum. And what that has in common with the suckers on a fluke is acetabulum is Latin for the little cup that they put vinegar in when they were serving feasts, right? If you've ever seen, pictures of Romans in their togas lying around on their couches enjoying a feast, one of them might say, "Oh, yes, pass the acetabulum, please," for vinegar served as a condiment. So acetabulum means vinegar cup, and so it gets used for any kind of cup-shaped anatomical structure. And I guess the acetabulum here of the fluke looks like a vinegar cup if you're on drugs. In between the two suckers, you can see a third little opening, pretty much dead center of this picture. That's the genital papilla. That's where eggs and sperm come out. What? Okay, don't know why that was going on. We don't classify worms like this anymore, though we used to. But these are still terms you might encounter. This is one from a fish called Helicometra. The mouth is up at the upper right. You can see the sucker, that's that round thing. Just back of the sucker, there's a muscular pharynx, kind of oblong. And if you look carefully, you can see that leads into a gut, which forks, and the two branches of the gut go all the way down to the posterior. So that Y-shaped gut is very typical. So you see the oral sucker at the upper right, and then dead center, that very round thing, that's the ventral sucker. And the ventral sucker here is in the midline, right in the middle of the organism. So we call this worm a distome. Stoma meaning mouth, because I guess people used to think the ventral sucker was another mouth. If the ventral sucker is at the posterior end of the body, it's an amphistome. Here the mouth is at the far right. That Y-shaped gut is a lot easier to see. You can see that short gut forks and forms these two branches, and here they've stained pretty dark red. And then at the very posterior end, you've got that second sucker. That's said to be amphistome. And then there's a few that have lost the ventral sucker completely. Notocotylis comes from ducks. This is a monostome. So you might encounter these terms as we look at diversity of flukes. There are some that are also called echinostomes because around the oral sucker they've got some spines that assist in holding on to the host. So you can see the spines very clearly looking like kind of a crown around that oral sucker. And sometimes there's even fancier attachment organs. This is a parasite of possums, Rhopalius caballeroi. The oral sucker is there in the middle, and on either side, you can see a grouping of fairly large spines. On either side of the oral sucker, the thing has a pair of retractable probosces, or proboscides, I guess is the right plural. They can be retracted, that's shown here, or they can be extended. This pair of floppy extensions can be squeezed out and latch on to the gut or the liver or wherever this is. They can latch on and help the fluke hold on. So you can have some fairly sophisticated attachment organs if it's adaptive. Okay, there's a diagram of the adult anatomy. The gut's in brown, and you can see that Y-shaped gut. There's little side branches off the gut, but it's still pretty clear that it looks like a Y or maybe a tuning fork. Flukes just feed on mucus. They'll grub up tissues. There's often a muscular pharynx just inside the mouth that acts like a suction bulb and can create strong enough suction that it can erode host cells. If it breaks open capillaries, the flukes might feed on blood. They can also absorb nutrients through the tegument to some degree, although not all species are equally good at doing that. But whatever you see in the fluke that isn't brown is reproductive, right? Remember, parasites can ditch a lot of the structures that free-living organisms need because those needs are taken care of by the host, but they often have to compensate by cranking up their reproductive output immensely, right? This thing might be having the time of its life living in a sheep, but, it's a very, from the point of view of an inch-long fluke that can't survive outside a sheep, it's an awfully long distance to the next sheep. So you'd better reproduce as much as you can to increase your odds of making it to the next sheep. And to do that, the testes are in light blue. In this species, the testes are in the posterior half of the organism. That very highly branched, blobby, sky blue things. There's actually two of them. are testes. The shape of the gonads is often very important for classification. Fasciola, they're very branched. Others, they may be a lot more compact. It all depends. And the two testes have a pair of vasa deferentia. That's the plural. The singular is, of course, vas deferens. And you might know that mammals, and I think quite a number of animals, whatever duct carries sperm away from the testes towards their ultimate destiny is called a vas deferens. So you might think there is, that male fertility and male infertility are pretty much the same thing. But the truth is there's a vas deferens between the two. That was a joke. Right. Okay. Sperm are conveyed to the male genital aperture, and in this species, that's located at the tip of a retractable genital papilla. The uterus also opens out at the tip of the genital papilla, the same opening for both sperm and eggs. The female reproductive parts are shaded here in very dark blue. On the sides, you can see that very highly branched, almost looking like shrubbery. That's vitellaria. Those are the structures that produce yolk. Those are on the left side and the right side, and you can see the little ducts connecting the vitellaria to a common point right about the center of the organism. Where those two ducts feed is they feed into a structure called the ootype, which is a round thing, dead center. And to the left of that branching structure that's dark blue is the ovary. The ovary produces the egg cells, of course. The eggs pass into the ootype, which is the circular thing, dead center. The eggs get yolk plastered on them from outside. And then the shell begins to be laid down by activity of a lot of single-celled glands. They're called Melis's glands, if you're curious. Leading away from that round ootype, you can see the rather windy uterus. That's where the eggs are fertilized and the shell solidifies. Now, these are capable of self-fertilization, but if there are two of them in the same sheep bile duct, they'll just pair up and put papilla together with papilla, and each can fertilize the other's eggs. And then the eggs ultimately pass out of the genital papilla, out the bile duct, and through the intestine, and out in the feces of the sheep. Again, the arrangements are important for classification. This is another livestock parasite, and it's one that's capable of parasitizing people as well. Actually, so is the sheep liver fluke. You can get infected by those. This is Dicrocelium, the so-called lancet liver fluke. And in this species, the uterus is posterior. It's that kind of brown, branchy thing in the lower right part of this picture. And the testes are anterior, and those are stained dark blue. There's two of them, and they're a lot more compact. They're these dark blue, almost circular things that you see kind of up and to the left a bit. On the left and right sides of the organism, you can see the branching vitellaria. Those very dark blue things that are kind of, wispy looking. On the left and right sides of the organism, that's the vitellaria. But yeah, this is just to show that arrangement of gonads differs depending on what species you've got. Learning how to recognize them is important if you ever have to identify species, as some of you might. Okay, so the eggs pass out, usually in feces. They may or may not be operculated. Operculum means little opening thing, like a manhole cover, and it usually refers to a structure in anatomy that looks like a trapdoor. So if you look at this picture at the upper right, You're seeing it from the side. It may not be really obvious, but you might be able to make out that at the upper right, there's kind of a cap on the end of the egg, and that will pop open to let the miracidium come out. The miracidium will penetrate into a snail and develop into a sac-like sporocyst, which has no gut and soaks up nutrition entirely through the tegument. That's a cross-section through a sporocyst, and you can see lots of little daughters inside. I think those might actually be daughter sporocysts, which in turn will develop redia inside them. And as I've mentioned in the sheep liver fluke, the sporocyst buds off redia inside, but others might bud off more sporocysts, or they might skip the redia and go straight to the cercaria. It all depends. Awesome example of this, and I'm going to post to the playlist on YouTube some video footage of this. This is the European amber land snail on the left. And on the left is an ordinary snail, and you can see it's got pretty small tentacles that it can pull all the way into its shell. On the right is the same snail infected with the trematode Leucochloridium paradoxicum. In that species, these sporocysts crawl up into the tentacles and develop into these colorful sacs that swell up inside the tentacles and that pulse back and forth. You can't see this in a still picture, but they're actually pulsating. They're too big for the snail to pull them inside, and they look exactly like absolutely delicious little maggots that a bird might want to swoop down and eat. So a bird will swoop down and eat the tasty little maggots, i.e. probably eat the snail or at least peck off the tentacles. And then the sporocyst will directly release cercaria. This is one that skips the redia stage, which promptly turn into adult worms and infect the bird. Oh, I really like this, and I will post the URL for the video footage of this. You really ought to see this. It's pretty horrifying. So there from the liver fluke, that's a redia. The mouth is up at the upper end of it. Inside the redia, you have a bunch of cercaria developing inside. Something really cool, just to give you an idea of how diverse this life cycle can be, there's a fluke called Hemasthala, whose intermediate host is a mud snail that lives on shallow marine mud flats. This has been studied in the state of California. I'm not sure how far it extends. But inside the snails, Hemasthala develops two different types of redia. Down below, in picture A, that big swollen thing is a primary redia, and you can see a bunch of cercaria smushed together, developing inside the redia. I can count at least 5 large cercaria developing inside that redia, and there's a couple of small ones packed in there as well, like clowns in a car. So the primary redia produces cercaria. The secondary redia doesn't, and the secondary redia will die inside the host. It will never go on to make adults. What's it there for? It turns out that secondary redia are hunter-killers, because what they will do is attack unrelated redia of the same species. So picture D over there at the left, that's a primary redia, and then a secondary redia labeled attacker is eating the primary redia. There in pictures B and E, you can see more footage of secondary redia attacking other redia that they're not related to. So it's neat. It's actually a digenean fluke with social castes. You know how termites have workers and soldiers and queens and all that. Here we've got this in a fluke living inside California land snails. I love this stuff. So Cercaria can actually take a lot of different forms. This is just a sample of different types of Cercaria. Some don't have much of a tail. Some have a pretty big tail. In one major group that we'll talk about on Monday, the Strigiiformes, the tail is forked. You see that up there at C at the top right. Aside from the tail, they are pretty close to being miniatures of the adults. As we've said, some Cercaria will burrow or be swallowed by the definitive host. Others form metacercaria, and these are actual metacercaria of fasciola, the sheep liver fluke, on blades of grass. So the metacercaria will just hang out there and wait for a sheep to eat it. Incidentally, humans can get fasciola. We can get infected by the sheep liver fluke. It doesn't happen very much because humans don't normally eat grass. The cases that I'm aware of, we don't tend to eat a lot of this in the US, but in Britain, there is an herb with a nice peppery flavor called watercress. And it actually grows in water, in streams. And the leaves have this very nice, slightly peppery flavor. They like putting them on sandwiches together with egg salads. So if you're ever in England, you may be offered an egg and cress sandwich or something like that. Anyway, I guess these days they probably farm most of their watercress, but you can gather watercress wild. But people who gather watercress from streams that are just downstream from a sheep pasture have been known to get fasciola in their own bile ducts if they ingest cress that happens to have metacercaria on it. So, yeah, this one is not a very common human parasite, and I'm not sure. I guess it'll produce eggs and they'll pass out in human feces. So I guess it could complete its life cycle in humans, but it usually doesn't. But yeah, you have to eat just the right type of vegetation from just the wrong place in order to get fasciola metacercaria in your gut. Some that you'll see probably in, we just did lab 3. I think we'll do this in lab 4. Some pretty common ones in Arkansas that we often spot. Species called Uvulifer and Miascus. The Cercaria will emerge from snails and then burrow into the skin of fish, and they'll form metacercaria in the skin. They don't do a huge amount of harm to the host as far as I can tell. They just stay in the skin. But the fish, as part of its immune response, tends to secrete melanin around the metacercaria. So this makes for black spots. If the fish gets eaten by its definitive host, which would be a fish-eating bird, a kingfisher or a heron, or something like that, the metacercaria will pop up and form adults. And the name for this is black spot disease or black grub. There are other species that can form yellow swellings on the fins. That's called yellow grub disease. One that I've actually spotted before will form metacercaria inside the fish's liver, which probably does harm the host quite a bit. That's called white grub disease, because when you cut open the fish's liver, there's these little white round swellings that look a little bit like grubs. I've actually seen that in some of the fish around here. Oh, there's yet another one that burrows into catfish skin and forms what's called red grub disease. That's actually a problem for catfish farmers, like the ones we have in eastern Arkansas. It doesn't make the meat inedible, but it does make it a lot harder to sell, right? who's going to want to buy a catfish with, strange red swellings all over its skin? Gross. So this can be an economic problem. It gets even weirder. There are parasites that manipulate host behavior to increase their own chances of propagation. Here's dicrocelium again. You saw a picture of this one earlier. The brown branchy stuff extending towards the lower right in the posterior end of the worm, that's uterus. The testes are in the anterior end, so they're to the left. That's that pair of dark pink staining blobs. The mouth is at the far upper left, so you can see the suckers pretty well. This one, by the way, is another one that is capable of infecting humans. You can get dicroceliasis if you happen to ingest metacercaria, although the definitive hosts are usually sheep, cows, and goats. They'll develop inside a snail. The cercaria will leave the snail and burrow into an ant, a secondary host. They'll form metacercaria, and the metacercaria will form cysts on the brain of an ant. And infected ants start doing something really weird. They'll crawl up, instead of crawling around, underneath the grass blades, down below, close to the soil, they'll climb the tip of a grass blade and lock their jaws onto the tip of the grass blade and just sit there. That increases the likelihood that they will be eaten by a sheep or a goat, which happens to be the definitive host of dicrocelium. So the metacercaria of dicrocelium, I'm not sure I know how this works neurologically, but they influence the ant to do something suicidal, to climb up to the tip of grass blades and wait to be eaten by a sheep. So parasites can do all sorts of things that go against their hosts' best interest, but improve the odds that the parasite will get passed on. Yeah, I like this stuff. I couldn't possibly make it up. So I'm going to go ahead and